Excellent. Now, I know, last question for you. I know that you have done some research with the United Nations this year on disinformation and the pandemic. Can you give us a really quick overview of that?
Sure. So several things. So at the beginning of the year, we published two briefs just as the pandemic was taking hold, called the Disinfodemic, which were about policy responses to disinformation in the context of the pandemic. And the aim was to also shine a light on some of the threats to freedom of expression from the over response, if you like, to disinformation that we're seeing in some contexts. Just last month, we released a book which was drawing on these briefs, but also dealt with electoral disinformation, called Balancing Act, which was published by the UN and contains something like 80 odd recommendations. And just last month as well, we published the first outcomes from the Journalism and the Pandemic Project, which really shone a light on just how difficult journalists are finding it to navigate disinformation, and particularly in connection with the platforms and the political actors we see as some of the main sources of disinformation. And that was done with the Tao Center at Columbia.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. Before I turn this over to you, a reminder to all of you out there, type your questions into the Q&A box. Not the chat box, the Q&A box, please, and we will get to your questions towards the end of the program. So Julie, Yvonne, Cindy, let me turn everything over to you, and I'm looking forward to listening to you.
Thanks very much. And now we're going to have a conversation to delve into some of those issues that I just highlighted. We've all been incredibly busy this year if we work in the territory of journalism and disinformation, and even more so if our jobs are at the intersection of those things. So, Cindy, I'm going to start with you. You were an intel officer with the CIA. You're now a disinformation investigator. I'd just like to know from you, in the context of these two huge disinformation crises that we've seen come to a head in 2020, one being the disinfodemic, if you like, connected to the pandemic, and the other, at least in the US context, being an election, which has been incredibly fraught, but also really dominated by disinformation narratives. So, from your perspective, drawing on all that experience, what do you think has been the most difficult challenge for communities, for societies more broadly, and for individuals to try to access reliable public health information on the one hand, and then information that they can trust that allows them to make an informed choice about, the president in the context of a national election?
hmm Thanks so much for that question, Julie, and thanks again for having me here at the conference. So we're certainly living in a very interesting time. Those of us in the disinformation space are calling it the infodemic, because it is sort of the biggest period of global misinformation and disinformation in history. For me personally, in the run up to this, I was writing a book, which has come out now. It's called True or False, and it covers a lot of the history of using false information by looking at sort of historical case studies and that sort of thing. And when I sort of put down the proverbial pen, I really had no idea that a couple of months later we were going to be faced with this infodemic, which again is the sort of largest case in history of false information circulating globally. So I think, to answer your question about the challenges, there are a number of challenges that people are facing. I think foremost among them is just the sheer amount of information flowing on a minute to minute, second by second basis. A lot of it being false or misleading or, politically divisive, sensational, all of those kinds of descriptors. And then, you sort of put that with the fact that it's happening in the course of a global pandemic in which emotions are high, people's lives are at risk, stress, all of those sort of very strong emotions that make it even more challenging for us to look at information and think about what we're seeing. It creates a lot of problems. And then you add on top of that as well that a lot of information is changing as we learn more about how the virus works, as public health officials figure out sort of, what are some things that the public should be doing, and then they provide recommendations, and then those recommendations might change again as we learn new information about how the virus is working. And as a result, people are really left with not exactly knowing how to sort through just the sheer amount of information that they're getting on a daily basis, how to pick out what is actually true and helpful, both in the context of the coronavirus and in the context of the U.S. election specifically. And because the information changes about the nature of the virus, and the information, more information comes out about political candidates and things like that, it has this other effect, again, in the context of having this huge amount of stress on all of us, in which people feel like they cannot trust traditional sources of information. And what we're seeing is this growth in people migrating towards more fringe ideas, both on the coronavirus and on political issues in the United States. People are often moving towards not trusting, for example, reputable media outlets, but instead migrating to their favorite sort of YouTuber that may have no expertise on either of these issues, but sure has a lot of passion and emotion
Yeah.
and a lot of things to say. So
And the
there are a lot of
hyper-partisan sites as well is something, a
yeah,
phenomenon we're
exactly.
seeing, like Parler and so on. Let's unpack that a bit later.
Yeah, there's a
I'm
lot we
keen
could go into there.
there is so much. It's just there is not enough time. But just briefly before I come to Yvonne, can you give us some insights into what perhaps you've been working on currently in this climate? I mean, is there a case you could point to that demonstrates for you, some sort of a benchmark in, oh my God, reactions to the level of disinformation, the type and kind of disinformation we're seeing? And I'm asking it that way because so many of us have become so fatigued. There's so much disinformation, misinformation, and as you say, just an avalanche of information. So, what, if anything, have you learned during this period in terms of the ways in which disinformation is being created and spread?
Oh gosh, having to choose one example is the challenge,
Yeah.
really. So I'm the vice president of analysis at Alethea Group, which is a disinformation investigations firm, and we've just done an enormous amount of work ahead of and now after the U.S. election. And it sort of has played out exactly as we thought that it would. That most of the disinformation would be domestically generated, and a lot of it would be focused after the election
Mm.
on claiming without evidence that there was fraud committed. And so that's a lot of the work that we're doing now, is understanding the genesis of those claims of fraud, which usually amount to a picture taken out of context, a very manipulated video, somebody making a claim who has no evidence or involvement in a particular case, and that going viral across multiple different platforms.
Okay, so that's interesting that you predicted, in fact, that these would be the outcomes, and we're seeing this not just cavalcade of lies and disinformation, but also, uh, the source of the disinformation itself is about fabrication. So there's so many layers when you start to unpack this. So Yvonne, in your role as head of research at the Atlantic, and given the Atlantic's role, really, I think, as one of the leading places for critical analysis of US politics and particularly in the US context, the pandemic, can you just give us some insights? Let's start with Donald Trump. How difficult is it to fact check a president whose brand is, in fact, in some ways, built on peddling disinformation and misinformation?
It it's very hard. It's a very difficult moment, and I'm quite shocked that we're at this moment, to be honest, because
Yeah.
he certainly set new boundaries and tolerances. Um, Weirdly, because of his record of just manufacturing facts and misstatements and lying, it you just recognize that you have to mistrust everything that's said, and that in and of itself is terrifying. But that's the bottom line. You almost can't take anything for granted, and that you just have to be extraordinarily careful in how you approach everything. And I think that there is sort of a reckoning now that in sort of the earliest stages, we've covered Trump for years, obviously, long
Mm.
before he was obviously always a colorful figure, to say the least. And um, and so we're used to that he would always be on the attack if there was anything negative said about him in the magazine or online. So we certainly were warned. But I think, sort of in years past and in ages past, we would have been much more careful. First of all, we would rarely have called someone a liar unless we had ample proof, and we obviously all went past that point long ago in terms of many of the president's misstatements. But we also we would have made more efforts in past to recognize, okay, well, we need to be balanced, we need to try to be fair, we need to try to recognize that there's another side to this, so to try to get to the heart of the matter. And I think now there we have realized that you just need to be so careful not to be manipulated by the
Mhm.
information or by what's said, and that in most cases that there are not facts to support what is being said by the president, or often his administration, so that you just have to consistently point that out, that
Mhm.
we are not just reporters saying this is what the president said. We must now say this is what the president said, and this is wrong because of the
Mm.
facts. This is wrong because of what the experts say. There is no proof. And that is something that is just endemic and has been, for these many years.
And you mentioned, you used the word reckoning, and that's from my perspective as well as an academic and a journalist, the experience that I feel we're living through, where we are seeing, particularly, Western ideas of objectivity and balance, which have been debated for many decades now as being problematic. But really, it seems that at this juncture, there is finally a recognition that perhaps the way in which those ideals, valuable as they were for centuries, need to be understood differently in the context of, viral disinformation, which is being, sourced to political leaders, not just Donald Trump. We've got Duterte, and we have, the Brazilian president as well. So this is a global phenomenon. But I mean, is this a case of perhaps some of the journalism traditions and practices almost being weaponized by these political actors who are sort of trapping journalists into a practice of faux balance, or a sort of almost like a stenography? So you get attacked if you draw conclusions and call somebody a liar based on evidence.
I think so, and I think it's the in the past there's always been, again, as you say, the ethics of a journalist is to be unbiased, is to report what's going on, to add in a level of understanding, and to add in important information so that someone can make up their own mind. But now there is the the slippery slope that you feel that, okay, well, what is the point at which we become advocates? What is the point at which we all of a
Yeah.
sudden do cease to be journalists and instead open up that very dangerous door of opinion? And I think that what has to be done, and what is continually at least our effort to do, is to back up whatever is said with facts. And if it's backed up with facts, if it's backed up with expertise, if it's backed up with statements, then you can always point to that and say, this is what I'm basing this on. I may not even believe it, but these are the truths that are underpinning this idea.
Mm.
And that in our own necessity as journalists is to consistently do that. And I think that the way that journalists avoid being used by and manipulated by authoritarian regimes of any sort, or even ideology of any sort, is by consistently going back to the ultimate truths. This is what is at the heart of this issue. These are the facts. This is the basis. And this is what I'm using to base my idea upon. And to call out
Mm.
when there are misstatements, when there are, when there's any question about whether something is wrong or not. And I think that the only thing that can be done, we certainly as journalists, the core of what we do is to tell the truth. And it's to tell the truth whether we believe in that, whether we espouse it or not, from a political perspective or a national perspective. It is simply to tell the truth in a way to communicate ideas to people so that they too can understand and make up their own minds. So as long as you don't fall into the sink of becoming, sort of a representative of something that you don't believe in, and that you continue to be faithful to it, then that is the way to stop being weaponized, to stop. We will, the media, unfortunately, at this current moment, is maligned, sort of more than it's ever been, and mistrusted. And this is a reckoning for everyone to recognize that journalism desperately, desperately needs to hold fast to our, reliance on facts and truth and expertise in general, and to sort of pummel our audiences to say this is imperative that we as a society, sort of reassess and say, no, no, we will not stand for untruth.
Mm. Which reminds me of something that I think Jay Rosen wrote overnight, which was, I'm going to paraphrase you here, Jay, so if you're watching, forgive me, but essentially journalists and journalism need to be aggressively pro-truth and pro-democracy. And I think this is a kind of interesting and clarion call to help us, refocus, and very much matches with what you're saying, Yvonne. So one element of this, and we'll come back to some of the work that you've been doing, Yvonne, looking at combating the disinformation that we're seeing through fact checking. But I just want to get into the problem that we have, that this is not just disinformation that exists inside the internet. This is a crisis we have that is having real consequences, physical consequences, whether that be for election outcomes or for physical attacks on people, particularly when we see this disinformation crisis intersecting with, say, sexism and misogyny and or hate speech of other kinds. So Cindy, back to you. I'm interested to know what you've seen, drawing on all of your experience with regard to the kinds of disinformation campaigns or acts of disinformation that risk or do in fact spill offline from the online environment into the offline world. I mean, are you seeing anything with regard, for example, to the rise of domestic terrorism in the US as a source of threat?
Yeah. So, I think there's sometimes a tendency, maybe not as much nowadays as there was maybe 2016 or earlier, to think of disinformation and misinformation as just, a meme or a post, a picture taken out of context or something like that. And we don't often look at sort of the larger strategy of disinformation actors and the larger sort of set of consequences that results from what are actually coordinated campaigns, oftentimes. And so I look at this through the lens of a lot of previous work that focused on things like foreign governments using disinformation and information operations to advance their foreign policy priorities while harming in return other countries. I looked at it through the lens of foreign countries using disinformation domestically by their political leaders to either gain power or hold power. And it was usually coupled with, and is usually coupled with, things like attacking press freedoms, attacking human rights, and that sort of thing, as a way of pushing out propaganda and creating figures that are meant to appear to be sort of the source of truth in a particular country. And then I also looked at it from the lens of terrorist groups, foreign terrorist groups that used disinformation and propaganda to primarily recruit, spread their ideology, and as part of that, using false information to really hone in on the idea that there is some sort of enemy. Fill in the blank with whatever the enemy may be, but gaining followers, gaining support, and that sort of thing through weaponized false information. So that's how I sort of come to this space with. And when I look at sort of how that has played out in the United States, I see a lot of very disturbing parallels, particularly in recent years. Again, with the reality that that the bulk of false information, both unintentionally and intentionally, being spread right now in the United States is being being done by Americans themselves, and even political parties, watching sort of the evolution of political parties um, adopting some of these disinformation like tactics in order to win votes, gain power, and seats for their parties has been very, very worrying to me. So I think those are like some of the broader consequences. But something that Yvonne mentioned earlier was the idea that people are losing trust
Mm.
in the media, and something that sort of is related to that I mentioned earlier as well is that as a result of that, people are increasingly moving towards trusting extreme sources of information that have no expertise in these areas, but sure make a compelling, sort of speech on YouTube about them, about those ideas, and that's just incredibly, incredibly harmful for a democratic society. Um, and
In
then
fact, it's the
also,
sort of, sorry, go on.
no, 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 please.
I was just going to say that there's, there's real parallels there, of course, with the radicalization of, young extremists, in sort of the wars that Western societies have been fighting against terrorism and in countries offshore. Um, those, young people in many cases have been radicalized through these kinds of methods. So again, we're seeing
Yeah.
those methods being adopted in democratic contexts with potentially devastating consequences in the real world. So, I mean, how do you combat that? Because this is partly about belief, it's partly about culture, it's a lot about emotion. I mean, how do you insert facts and truth and credible journalism into an environment like that and actually expect it to make a difference?
Yeah, so thank you for that, because that's exactly what I was going to move to next, which is the extent to which domestic violent groups have tapped into the same strategies
Right.
that foreign terror groups have used for years at this point to again recruit followers, push their ideology, and sort of paint this picture of an enemy. So we're seeing very similar tactics of accounts online pushing false claims about particular targets of theirs to build up this idea of there being an enemy, recruiting people to participate in events, and then messaging afterwards with false information about supposed violence committed by this again enemy. So people ask me all the time, what do we actually do about this? And I wish that I had this like silver bullet, this easy silver bullet. If we do this one thing, we'll solve it, right? I go back to the reality that we're talking about a very complex problem without an easy solution, and really requires sort of longer term strategic um, initiatives and investment and a whole of society effort to combat this issue, because it's things like getting additional curriculum in public schools that teaches digital media literacy, that helps people understand how you find good sources of information, how to do things like fact check a bit on your own, how to find how to do sort of basic critical thinking skills. It's also addressing things like systemic racism,
Mm.
which has been a decades
Sense
long
of
process, but
alienation and yeah,
of alienation,
yeah.
institutionalized discrimination, and all of that are extremely complex problems, but they absolutely feed into this problem of the rise of domestic violence that particularly targets people from marginalized communities,
Mm.
and same with sort of gendered based harassment online as
Exactly.
well.
Which was exactly what I was about to move to. This is turning into a beautifully succinct conversation. But Yvonne, I was actually going to raise that with you. I mean, we've discussed already the fact that journalists are frequently attacked in the context of disinformation campaigns. So they're not just using these techniques to try and discredit or dissuade journalists from focusing on facts and redirecting or misdirecting. They're of course targeting journalists, particularly women journalists. In research I'm doing at the moment, looking at online violence against women journalists, we're seeing a real intersection with disinformation tactics at the extreme end of the impacts of online violence. And so I'm wondering whether in your work you're head of research, but with every fact check you're putting information into the field potentially that is somehow incendiary to misogynistic groups, to far right groups, because you're presenting accurate, reliable information. Have you made any observations about the way women journalists you work with, or in fact, have you yourself experienced any of this kind of, abuse or harassment connected to disinformation?
Um, Luckily, I haven't. I'm sort of behind the closet, sort of working away. Um, but I actually I keep preparing myself for it, and as sort of the company as a whole, and our journalists, sort of have been basically on the forefront of this. And we have had, and we've as a company had to be extremely careful in terms of trying to sort of combat the sort of verbal attacks on social media for all of our journalists. And it's been very harrowing to see the growth of that the more open that we've become, and the more sort of just the more reach that we have has obviously exposed our journalists and our sources to more attacks. And there have been many security issues that have occurred as a result of people coming out and telling the truth about COVID, about the election, about sort of any number of things. And it's interesting because we sort of expect that. You expect that when you're talking about ISIS, years ago. You expect that when you're sort of discussing other elements, when you're dealing with extremist societies. But now, unfortunately, you're seeing the rise, at least in terms of I'm seeing the rise sort of for our community of journalists, where they are under constant attack via social media, and people arriving up at their homes basically to sort of argue their case and to accuse them of every crime in the book. And that's a terrifying thing. We
Mhm.
are it's something that as a company that we have to take extremely seriously, and we do. But it's paramount. And so to see it in the context of our current situation, where obviously everyone's feeling quite nervous about sort of our country and the many issues that we have, it is a rather terrifying instance. But that all the more so why we have to publicize that this is happening. We have to publicize that people are being attacked because they have said that, sort of they've pointed out how many lies, sort of have been said, what the
Yeah.
misinformation is in terms of COVID. And again, the only my belief in this is that the moment that starts happening is the moment that you start to rile people up to recognize that we must speak truth to this extremist response, that we
Mhm.
must sort of try to educate and try to put in place better systems whereby people are able to realize that they are being manipulated and that they are being riled up by complete misinformation and to be pawns in another person's game. And that is ultimately what, as journalists, we're trying to do to begin with, that we are trying to educate and inform. And it's crucial. It's crucial to our society. It's just crucial to our sort of worldview. But it's a very important thing. So unfortunately, we just have to have more reports like the ones you're working on, and sort of and Cindy's work in terms of different disinformation. And we have to be better able to communicate the necessity for kids to be schooled from a young age to recognize that they're only listening to one side of a story,
Mhm.
and that is crucial. And I do think it's going to take um, a fair amount of work, both on sort of governmental level, educational level, and certainly, sort of nonprofits to say this is happening, that people are being victimized because of misinformation, and you need to guard against being a pawn in this.
Which paints a much more challenging problem than one simply of lies versus facts and fact checking, solving misunderstandings. I mean, we have moved way beyond that. And what you're proposing there is a much more sophisticated response from journalism than perhaps we've talked about, 5 years ago, for example, when we spoke of, the role of fact checking and media and information literacy as being real defences, and they are obviously important defences, but they can't work on their own, can they? So I guess, what does that mean for investigations? What does it mean for turning disinformation or responses to disinformation into a beat, for example, and partnering with people like Cindy and other researchers to do that sort of collaborative work to really, put to the foreground these kinds of challenges and encourage, fresh ideas about the way to respond to this crisis.
I think we are at such a different level than we were even a few years ago, in terms of when all of a sudden you had a bevy of sort of fact checkers that were fact checking speeches as they
Yeah,
were going on, and certainly it's crossed over from something that people didn't know what fact checking was
yeah,
10 years ago practically. So it really has, but that's because the news as a whole and media as a whole is a completely different environment than it was years ago. So the systems that are in place at a sort of a place like the Atlantic, or sort of a really tight editorial standards and system of copy editors and checkers, and that
mm,
everything goes through filter and everything is discussed ad nauseum with multiple editors and multiple viewpoints, that doesn't exist and can't exist obviously in different forms that we're now seeing of half of the population is getting their news from Facebook. that
yeah,
that is a massive influencer sort of to this. So I do think that there's an element to which we have to redefine how people approach news, and we have to redefine, and I think all of this is part and parcel of our reinvigorating people's faith in journalism. I believe that if people are sort of told why something is wrong, that they then understand what is at the heart of the issue. And I think that's something that we do need to. We're starting down this road in terms of saying there were X amount of errors, sort of
mm,
within this speech, or there were difference of opinions between, sort of these varying forces, and this is what one says versus another, and this is why it's wrong. And pointing that out is certainly a part of it. But I think in terms of social media in general, that we have to put into place, and whether I do think it's on a both government and a sort of an institutional level, we have to enforce those rules, and we have to say that there needs to be free speech, obviously, and people need to be allowed to represent sort of their opinions, but it needs to be called out. And we as journalists, I think that's our main aim, is to call out if something is an opinion, that something's an opinion. If something is widely held belief backed up by experts, then that's the case as well. But I do think it takes a sort of a different vantage point to recognize that there are so many. I mean, Cindy was probably going to sort of, she speaks about this in terms of disinformation. People go to their local sort of website for wherever they are living in Des Moines, and think they look at the Des Moines whatever and that it's an actual news source,
mm,
when in fact it's basically promoted by PR reps and journalists being paid a few dollars to produce a piece on command and to craft it to speak to political vantage. That is not news, and that is not journalism. And as journalists, we have to stand up and say we need to be accountable. This is why people do not trust, because
mm.
in many instances we've completely hollowed out our traditional news sources, and there needs to be a reckoning as a result.
Yeah, in fact, Cindy, that is something I was going to bring up, and it's work that's been done by colleagues Emily Bell and Co at the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism at Columbia. This idea of pink slime journalism, where you have seen, the purchasing and then weaponization of old or defunct titles, but also the creation of fraudulent titles or hyper-partisan titles that border on disinformation. And so it really does feed that crisis of trust, because something that looks, smells, and tastes like journalism, is quite difficult to combat when what you're actually saying to people constantly is trust in credible, reliable journalism, and distinguishing that is difficult. Do you have any insights from the work that you've been doing, Cindy, about the way audiences engage with those hyper-partisan sites, or try and differentiate between what is genuinely critical, independent journalism and what is this kind of muck?
Yeah, so I've done a fair amount of work on some of the pink slime networks that I think were referenced in that great work of your colleagues. So part of the problem is that I mean, a couple of things I would say here. So um, you know, as soon as the internet was created, really, it became sort of taken over by the users, right? Everybody came out with a website, a web page, then a blog. Everyone became a blogger. Then everybody got a YouTube channel. And so there are just so many efforts online to produce sort of independent, what's called independent news, and it's seen as sort of the exact same in terms of standards and quality as an actual legitimate media outlet. Oh, and also it happens to say exactly what I want to hear. And so that's a really tough challenge that media outlets have to combat, is this other thing looks exactly like our thing and it hits all of the bias check marks for consumers that we don't hit, right? Because we're providing fair and accurate reporting. So part of the other piece of this is, I think we really have to contend with and think about um, the ways in which younger generations consume information that are not the same ways that the older generation consumes information. Part of that is, younger folks. You mentioned half of the population gets their news from Facebook. Well, the vast majority of younger folks get their information from Snapchat, and they go to TikTok and they do Instagram stories, and they watch endless hours of YouTube channels from their favorite, fill in the blank influencer who also happens to talk about news related items. And so the ways that they consume information are very different. And on top of that, research has shown that they see sort of all of this kinds of information as equal, or as the same. So a meme with a data point in it is the same as sort of a YouTube channel with a data point in it, is the same as a website with a data point in it, and that sort of thing. So when we look at how we provide information and news, we have to keep in mind sort of how the different generations are consuming that information, and be aware that people who have less positive intentions, like political organizations that create, for example, a very real case of more than 1,000 different pink slime websites called things like the Des Moines Register, the Indiana Herald, the New York whatever, that look exactly like the news that they consume for an actual, legitimate media outlet, because it's a WordPress template. It's a template they can get from Wix or WordPress. And so, I think we have to start having some tough conversations about how we're actually providing news to people online.
And this brings us to the big question, the elephant in the room, which we've sort of danced around a bit. That is the role of the platforms, the role of these hyper-rich US-based corporations. For the most part, they're US-based, although TikTok, of course, is a Chinese-based operation. And we have a situation where journalism has been entwined with these platforms now for nearly a decade. There is a case being made by some for a decoupling of journalism and the platforms. Whether or not that addresses any of the issues of trust and the confusion around facts among audiences is a question up for research. But can I come back to you briefly, Yvonne, on this question of our cooperation with, collaboration with, and I would argue at times capture by the big tech companies through platforms like Facebook and so on. What is your response to their role in this crisis, and how does journalism deal with that, given that we are, particularly in a socially distanced environment of a pandemic, increasingly reliant on said same platforms for developing audiences that we're trying to speak truth to?
It's certainly complex, and it definitely is the elephant in the room. It's sort of in this case. I think that there's certainly is a huge movement to try to hold their hand, sort of lead them down the road to recognize that they are behaving as media companies, and to pretend that they aren't is ridiculous under the circumstances, given that so many people are reliant. I mean, sure, we're, just as any media company, we're reliant on, sort of the outsourcing almost of our articles, and the transfer of them sort of within these companies. And I think that there should, if anything, be more connection than less, because I think that the thing that the large media companies have to offer, especially, sort of ones that have been around for a while, or who are just completely dedicated and transparent, are to basically to say that there are standards in place for a reason. We do this, we go through this, we take care with things because it matters. Because at the end of the day, our society is dependent on the norms, and sort of our polarization is at epic proportions because we don't have a shared set of facts. So if we can basically bring everyone to the same accountability, to sort of work with companies to say that our, sort of free speech, while paramount, has to be, in some respects, it just needs to be guarded so that it can continue, and that we don't have to shut sort of everything down just to control the inaccurate information that's out there. And I do think that there need to be, more difficult conversations, and sort of through government, and holding big media, big, sort of these platforms accountable for that. And I know there are efforts in terms of, sort of the idea that there are ex fact checkers on duty, sort of at Facebook and other, companies. But I personally think that is a drop in the bucket, and I just don't think that it's enough to combat this. So I think it needs a tiered approach, both from, sort of educating people to realize that they are at the whims of just where, sort of whoever clicks enter, at any particular moment, and that it does not go through sort of any level of filtering. And also, sort of on a government to hold disinformation out there and to hold places accountable. We in
Yeah.
the media, we've always been accountable. If we lose our credibility, we lose everything.
Mm.
But that's it's
Yeah, so that role of recognition of your role as a publisher is, and then the embrace of perhaps ethics and standards on the one hand, but just to feed some data into this conversation, the study that we did with the Tao Center at Columbia on journalism and the pandemic, and I'll put some links in the chat in a moment for people who are interested in digging into that. We found that the journalists identified political actors, government officials as among the top sources of disinformation, but the main vector for disinformation, according to this survey of over 1,400 journalists internationally, was in fact Facebook. And I guess the difference is independent journalism seeking to verify information and share it in the public interest versus a platform that is ostensibly a vector for disinformation with limited fact checks and limited capacity to deal with this flood. But Cindy, what does that mean before we go to questions from the audience? What does the role of these companies as vectors for disinformation, with the backdrop of of congressional inquiries into questions around regulation, and these are patterns repeated all around the world? What do you think needs to shift?
Yeah, I mean, first, I think we have to make sure that when we're talking about platforms, that we're not only looking at Facebook. The platforms are very different in terms of the amount of resources that they've devoted to addressing this problem and the policies that they've put in place to address these problems. And so much of the campaigns that I work on are cross-platform campaigns. They're not just on Facebook, or they're not just on
Hmm.
Twitter. They're starting and they're moving to different
Yeah.
platforms and then being reseeded. So it's important to hold all of their feet to the fire, I think.
Yes. Yes.
I come to this issue really with the idea as transparency as the goal. I don't think that, um, because the tendency for these US based platforms is to focus on primarily Western information threats and predominantly English um, information threats, um, there's just a whole rest of the world that is completely forgotten. And so, you know, should we expect the platforms to hire a linguist for every single country in the world, a disinformation investigator for every single country, and that sort of thing? I'm not sure that that's realistic. And so you have to focus on sort of broader platform changes. And again, so I go back to transparency, which is users should not have to be a disinformation investigator like myself to find out where their information is coming from. You
Mm.
shouldn't have to go on a wild goose chase hunting down all the dark parts of the internet to find out that the five, Facebook groups or the five, Twitter accounts that you follow are all actually operated by the same individual trying to flood your feed with repetitive false narratives to influence your behavior and views. So all policies I feel like should be devoted towards getting more at that transparency.
Transparency and independence, critical, yes. Let's go to some questions now from people who've been patiently waiting for them to be asked. So Barbara Lenson asks a curly one and an important one. She asks about the role of Fox News and its status in terms of disinformation, how that role of a partisan news outlet working with a political party to reinforce disinformation, how that manifests and how it needs to be responded to. Yvonne, I'm going to let you take that one first.
You're throwing me under the bus.
Not me, not me.
Well, I think on one level, certainly we have to think about that Fox News has many different shows and many different reporters, and so I want to be careful about painting them all with the same broad brush stroke. I think that the problem is not necessarily sort of the Fox News shows that are, sort of trying to talk about the news. It's more in sort of the opinion and the talking heads that rant and rave, and I think that is an element of it. I think having grown up at the time when you basically had three networks and sort of and PBS for good
Times.
measure. Oh God, that seemed a long time ago. And where we all you could watch sort of any particular one, and you were really looking at a news reader, someone who was reporting just factual information. And I think that unfortunately we can't put that genie back into the bottle. That day has passed. But I think that there is an element to which we have all become guilty of looking to the sensationalized, the 24-hour news cycle where everything is exaggerated. Even, sort of the truth is exaggerated within an inch of its life, practically. So I think that part of it is that we have all become culpable in sort of the immediacy and in the extreme nature of TV news. And anyone, sort of on any partisan level, whether sort of the most extreme to the most conservative, it basically it's still all not really mainstream. It's all so extreme because they're feeding into our own little echo chambers, and we are all now choosing to go to specific news sources because they reinforce our understanding of our own beliefs. And I think that in and of itself is something that we can do as sort of consumers of the news to change, and also to just demand better, to demand higher standards. If something is inaccurate and if something is wrong, to call it out, to stop, sort of to stop watching, to stop listening, to go to better sources. And I do think that places, media needs to be held accountable at every turn, and they need to be transparent about the information.
And certainly, we can't deny the fact that the internet has delivered incredible diversity. Yes, we're in a process of polarization now and a kind of retreat, which is deeply problematic. But and it's given us the opportunity as audience members to speak directly to journalists and about journalism, which is something really important to acknowledge all the time, I think. Here's one for you, Cindy, from Todd Greentree, who asks, how do you rate the US government's performance in combating foreign disinformation specifically for the 2020 elections and in general. And I might get you to add to that domestic disinformation, given what you said before.
Um, well, starting with the caveat that since I am no longer in government, I don't have the same understanding of what has occurred behind the scenes. And when you're talking about specifically addressing foreign disinformation, a lot of that wouldn't be public. I think there was a lot of consternation when the director of national intelligence came out with a letter prior to the election saying that there were disinformation threats from not just Russia but also China and Iran. And from my perspective, actually, it is the responsibility of the intelligence community to raise threats as they are. And Russia is not the only foreign disinformation actor out there looking to advance their foreign policy goals via information operations. China is increasingly having a role and is building their capability, and Iran is as well. They're certainly not as capable as Russia, but they are getting there. And so that is a threat that people need to have on their radar. So I think, in terms of does the government, public servants, that is, right? We're not talking about administrations, but public servants, do they have their eyes absolutely on the threats and the right threats and understand the nuances between the threats? I think that is true. And from what I have seen, Chris Krebs and CISA put out a letter after the election saying it was the most secure election we'd ever had. And from my perspective, having followed it, in terms of threats from foreign actors, we have, that is accurate, and we had a very safe and secure election. I think in terms of domestic disinformation, just quickly, we have not begun to scratch the sort of surface on the extent of the problem, because it is difficult for the government to talk about Americans to begin with, and to look at them in remotely the same way as we look at foreign actors. So it creates additional challenges.
With so many things, it's easier to think of the other rather than to look inwards,
Yes.
isn't it? It's a real challenge. Here's one from Barbara Chatterjee, and we're going to go about 5 minutes over because there are a lot of questions. Barbara raises something that I've been thinking about a lot, and which is a bit of a struggle. In much discussion about combating disinformation, we hear from experts the need to remove emotion from our responses to information. I've been arguing that you cannot separate emotion from journalism. I mean, journalism is about humanity and empathy to an extent. So let's get into this question. Barbara points to the fact that Barbara, I'm going to come back to your question. Have I read the right question? There's a question about, no, it's from Paul Bloomhart. Sorry, Barbara, I'll come back to your question. He says that it gives the example of the southern border in the US with the build the wall situation, and the incarceration of children, the removal from their families. That truth may hinge to an extent on moral outrage and societal values, he says. So there are facts. Sometimes they're difficult to dig up due to the opacity of public communications, but the story does hinge on how a reader feels about what they see or read, and in fact, this can tend to either trigger a positive response in terms of empathy or a negative response in terms of they had it coming. So I don't know whether that allows you, Yvonne, to comment on the role of emotion and the way we're seeing it being weaponized by disinformation actors, but also its ongoing important role in framing stories and revealing information, the human experience.
It's an interesting question and a good one, Paul. I think, and I agree with you, Julie, that all sort of the reason why we read and often care about things is because they're presented with emotion, and so it's very hard not to. We can't disassociate ourselves from that. It's at the heart of why we're also sort of telling people that they should care about it. And I think it's pervasive, and it's something sort of that as checkers we sort of struggle with, because we're not supposed to be emotional about things. We're supposed to be unbiased, and we're supposed to just look at the facts and try to discern how that and if they stand up. and sometimes the emotion that's sort of involved in it can be difficult to assess. But we always try to sort of say, okay, well, what's going too far? What are we, over egging the pudding type of thing? Is it, are we truly just drumming this up in order to make someone try to
Yeah.
think something about this topic that they may not? And we're frequently sort of talking to the authors and talking to the editors and saying, well, yes, this is true, and yes, I know you feel this, but some others may not. So let's explore that. Let's try to sort of understand why others may not think that this is the right response. So I think that if something's carefully thought through, that the emotion is always going to represent sort of what a journalist brings to it, and it pushed them to write the piece in the first place, no doubt. They're, sort of, and to try to change someone's mind, to show that there are people behind this suffering and that there are true effects, that, sort of, there are true negative effects that are occurring. And I think um, any good piece of journalism is going to deal with the other viewpoint as well as their own. And I think that that is something. It's just a sign of a good piece if you can show that this is not how, sort of, everyone thinks, but this is what I see, these are what the facts are, and this is what it leads me to believe. Here are the stories, and lets everyone ultimately judge for themselves whether they are moved to change their mind about even some small element of it, or if it just reinforces sort of their beliefs now that they know the facts and now that they know this situation. We're all
Mm.
growing and learning, and we are living in a very complex world, and we need to be reminded of all the different viewpoints of it.
Mm.
Julie, can
One,
I
yes,
jump
please
in on this?
go.
As a news consumer and somebody who works in the disinformation space, just from my perspective, I think using the emotional and sort of personal connection that reporters, can tap into to tell stories can be really, really useful in showing the harmful effects of disinformation. I would point to, and the people behind it as well. I would point to two particular pieces. Joni O'Sullivan from CNN, who did a thing that I was featured in. So kind of biased in raising actually both of them, that I'm going to raise, but on the harmful effects to one's life of having gone into the whole QAnon conspiracy
Mm.
world
Yeah.
and sort of coming out the other end of it, realizing they've been completely hoodwinked for years. And then the other piece that I would mention is by Isaac Stanley Becker, who wrote a piece on some work that we did at Alethea Group on a financially motivated, for-profit grifter who created a large network of sites to steal people's data essentially and then resell it to political campaigns, political organizations, and that sort of thing, um, for profit, but used, false, misleading, sensational, politically divisive content to do so. And being able to paint those very sort of personal stories, I think, as a reader, trying to make sense of what I am seeing in my feeds and who is putting it there, those
Mm.
kinds of stories can just be so, so effective.
Yeah, and so feeling is a big part, perhaps, of motivating our response as communities, as journalists, to this crisis of disinformation and the corrosive effects on democracy and truth. That's a really important point. And finally, Barbara, I said your name and then I started to ask the question and then pivoted. So your question was actually about COVID-19 and the way in which it's being represented in the media with an ongoing emphasis, repetition of case numbers, infection rates, and so on. And your suggestion is perhaps there is a need to focus more on, what we don't know and what we can expect to change, because we have created, and I think you alluded to this, Cindy, that facts are facts, but of course, facts over time can be met with additional new information, which is also factual, that builds a different story, and that can create confusion. So science is not necessarily fixed, although we have, of course, the example of climate change, which is a decided reality of science. But her point is, I think, that it will allow people to be better at decision making if they're not constantly bombarded by just current statistics, but if there's more explanation, more context, What do you think, Yvonne and Cindy, to close?
I think that obviously, sort of there is the exhaustion sort of from those numbers, and but the reality is that those numbers are lives behind it, and that those numbers are sort of telling to what our country and nation, sort of worldwide, we're going through. I think that context is always key. So to be able to say, we believed this in March of last year, that if this were done, this would change. Now we've reassessed, and now we realize, and we've learned how to better control it, sort of in a hospital setting. And these are the things that we've determined. I think, though, again, if you were going to a good news source, if you were going to an appropriate journalist, if you're, sort of whatever ilk, they're going to give you the necessary context. That is what a journalist should do. If you're going to an influencer on YouTube, you're not going to get that. So the key is to go to, sort of quality information first and foremost, and for us to always recognize that we need to give a sense of what has changed in an ever changing story.
Cindy, do you have anything to add? We're going to have to wind it up.
Yeah, just really quickly. In the as a former Intel analyst, we actually spend a lot of time talking about all the things that we don't know, to inform policymakers of sort of gaps of information, and also as a way to show how a situation might change if we got additional information. You can see that for yourself in public Intel assessments that have been declassified and released. That we do spend a lot of time on that, and that's actually a way of boosting or like demonstrating credibility to a policymaker. So I think, as Yvonne mentioned, you will find reputable news outlets doing very similar things. Of there is a lot we don't know about this particular issue, and in particular on coronavirus. And I think that is a way of actually boosting credibility with readers and information consumers, is to be clear about how things are changing and the gaps in information.
Okay, great. And I completely forgot, Sandy Campbell, to put the links. I was too engrossed in the conversation that I promised in the chat. Sorry about that, folks. I'll tweet them out in just a moment with a hashtag for the conference, and you can find them there. Back to you, Sandy. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And just on that point of the links, we'll certainly have them on our website on the specific page. I would be remiss for not showing the following screen. This is Cindy's great book called, maybe I'll just make it bigger here so we can all see it, which is a CIA Analyst Guide to Spotting Fake News. Check it out. It's quite an achievement, and Cindy's going to be talking to us and to our students on Saturday about this book, and we're really grateful for that. Yvonne Rolzhausen, thank you so much for doing this and participating, and giving us a kind of behind the scenes look at everything that goes on. Thank you. Cindy, thank you so much. As always, we'll see you again this Saturday. Julie, marvelous. Thank you. That was wonderful. You are all cordially invited to Journalism Under Fire 2021. Stay tuned for more details, but
hopefully in person, please.
Definitely in person. And we really look forward to it. So on that score, we are a little bit over. Thanks for staying with us. And hold on, I seem to have disappeared. Thanks for staying with us. And we will see you all in less than 2 hours for Alexa Koenig, who's going to be leading a big conversation on the new newsroom featuring innovation and collaboration. So stay with us. We'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.